inclusion and excellence in education. So I will share my screen now with you all, that then will allow you to see the PowerPoint that I've prepared. Okay. All right. Okay, so that appears to be working. So I'll move this into slideshow. All right, so everyone can see the PowerPoint well and okay?
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. So the formal title of my presentation today is Reimagining Black Boyhood, Strategies for Relational Learning at School. And again, just a couple of thank yous in terms of just anyone at Molloy who played a role in my being invited and having this opportunity. I just wanted to extend, again, a heartfelt thank you, and to also Dr. Cochran as well for orchestrating this event. And my aspirations for our time together is very much less one where I share with you, but more of a space where we collaborate, where we partner, where we exchange ideas. Me as a researcher and also a past educator, and then also all of you as educators or school professionals in general, us sharing our ideas about how to serve a particular population of students better, because we all stand to learn and grow through partnership, and I enjoy these opportunities to actually work with school professionals who are in schools every day working with children and youth, and I think that that's just important for me to be connected to those communities. So just wanted to share that aspiration. And in terms of the goal or purpose, I just want to share a little bit about who I am and my background as a university researcher, also a teacher educator and scholar activist in what is referred to often as boys education. And I want to formally present two frameworks, one framework being a more theoretical conceptual framework around a reimagining of Black boyhood, and then a more applied framework around relational teaching with Black boys. And the organization, in an effort to somewhat be more interactive in the approach, I do want to formally present the two frameworks, but then as I present them, I do want you to be thinking about the very boys that are in your lives, in your schools, in your neighborhoods and communities that you interact with, as a way to ground your thinking about both these theoretical as well as applied frameworks in the service of Black boys and their learning and development within schools. So just always want us to be mindful of the boys in our lives and how we see those boys being represented or not represented in some of the ideas that are presented within these two frameworks that we can talk about and we explore. So who am I? I began my career in education as a first grade teacher, as Dr. Cochran mentioned, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is where I grew up. And it was in a co-ed elementary school that by default had a single sex intervention for a group of primarily Black and Latino boys. And my well-meaning principal at the time had asked all of the pre-K3 and pre-K4 teachers to identify students that they thought could benefit from an early intervention in terms of their academic performance as well as their school behavior or school conduct. And by default, that list of students came back primarily as Black and Latino boys. And in many ways, I became the embodiment of an intervention from a group of boys that had already, essentially at the age of 6, been labeled at risk. And again, my very well-meaning, very respected school leader in the district, she was often referred to as a successful turnaround school leader. And I remember her saying to me on my very first day of teaching, "You are their last chance." So that was my introduction to classroom teacher, to being a classroom teacher, where the risks were high. And my goal was clear, to turn the boys around, so to speak, by 3rd grade, so that their 3rd grade test scores, as probably many of you know, which is a key assessment year, wouldn't affect the school's overall annual yearly progress. So this was a time in American education where the No Child Left Behind Act was just presented, and there were greater accountability measures for teacher practice and for school performance. And my principal's task was to, in essence, improve our school's ranking. because this was also at a time in American education where you could open up the local newspaper. In Milwaukee, it was the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and they would list all of the schools that would be in need of improvement. And the elementary school that I taught at was at the top of that list. And so my principal was determined to get our name off the top of that list. So the stake was high, the stakes were high, the charge was clear. And when it became clear that I was going to be their classroom teacher, or when it was determined that I was going to be their classroom teacher, all of the narratives started to fly in terms of the boys that I was going to inherit as my classroom students, or how they were going to show up in my classroom. So this boy never stays in his seat. This one can't keep his hands to himself. This one's mother calls a lot in terms of his behavior. This one talks loudly when he speaks. So it's all these narratives that I started to be told about the boys that I was about to teach that were very much mired in these race and gender stereotypes about Black boys and men in American society. And then there were also an expectation around who I was to be as their classroom teacher. So how I was to show up as a Black male who is an elementary school teacher who grew up in the same neighborhood and community that the boys in my classroom lived in. So this was an elementary school in Milwaukee, and that a housing project was right across the street from the school that I also grew up in. And this was an elementary school that I had also attended. So again, being the embodiment of an intervention for a group of boys, that I had a similar kind of experience. And the expectation was clear for me as well. The charge was to maintain order, was to ensure that their behavior was in line, that it became more of a stance around quarantine and control and management of their bodies and keeping them out of trouble, rather than teaching and learning and development. And I mean, you've known me for less than 10 minutes, and I'm none of those things. So I very much struggled initially as their classroom teacher. And in hindsight, it became relationships with the boys that became a window into seeing them outside of, or more than, the narratives that I was told about them. So relationships that I got to explore their perspectives, their experiences, their worldviews, asking them questions about their worlds that I also shared and their experiences of it, in order to understand it and then more effectively be a classroom teacher to them. So asking questions that come from a place of curiosity about their experiences in order to understand and then be a better teacher of them in light of those experiences. And I argue that when learning is the goal within the context of a school environment, where oftentimes we're navigating these lines of difference, boys of color, oftentimes historically within the US, I was in a school that had a predominantly white teaching class or teaching cohort, that there's these lines of difference that we're crossing around race and class, that when learning is the goal, there needs to be an intentionality brought to those, to relationship building within the context of learning. So it was very much my experiences as a classroom teacher and the challenges and successes that I had as a classroom teacher that became issues and concerns and the focus of my research going forward in the future. And I just want to share from the outset that there are these two frameworks that I'm presenting represent two pieces of scholarship that I'll share with Dr. Coughlin and make sure that you guys all have access to. The first one being Reimagining Black Boyhood. It was co-authored with a colleague of mine at Berkeley, Michael Dumas, and the subtitle being Towards a Critical Framework for Educational Research, Policy, and Practice. And then the other framework is around relational teaching with Black boys, again, strategies for learning at a single-sex middle school for boys of color. And this actual article was a part of a larger special issue published within Teachers College Record a couple of years ago that was intended to be a pulling together of the best of what we know from empirical research around supporting boys and men of color through the K through 12 and higher ed pipeline. So the title of it is Erasing the Deficit, My Brother's Keeper, and Contemporary Perspectives on Black Male School Achievement. So again, the best of what we know through research around how to support boys and men of color from preschool up through higher education. So if you're interested in just a really great resource that's evidence-based, that's research-based to support Black boys and boys of color in particular, I definitely recommend this special issue. And my paper around relational teaching was Black boys was within that special issue. So as a classroom teacher of these young boys, when I asked them questions about their worlds and about their perspectives and about their experiences, it became very clear to me that they were the furthest thing from a lot of the narratives that I was shared about them, or that was shared with me about them. And in many ways, they were oftentimes high performing and just disengaged and oftentimes just bored in their other classes. That then, as I began to think about what are some ways in which I can contribute to what we know about the experiences of Black boys within schools, I made a point to think about what are the ways in which oftentimes boys are actually resisting, challenging, contesting the imposition of the negative race and gender stereotypes that are often imposed upon them within school contexts. And then in ways that actually support their overall academic success and positive identity development. So it became an intentional interest in how do they resist these negative race and gender stereotypes. So in the presentation of the Reimagining Black Boyhood framework, in sitting down to co-author this essay or this piece with Michael Dumas, it was a goal of ours, or a shared goal of ours, that this paper wouldn't just be one that would be a traditional academic paper that would be flat, that would be static, that wouldn't, we wanted to be a document that would inspire. We wanted it to be multimodal. So in addition to being read, we wanted it to be spoken, we wanted it to be heard, we wanted it to be essentially kind of lived in life. So as a way of presenting this framework, I do want to share two excerpts with you from it as a way to kind of introduce you to the essence of this Reimagining Black Boyhood framework. So when 12-year-old Tamir Rice was shot and killed while playing in his neighborhood park, the police officer who fired the gun radioed in, shots fired, male down, Black male, maybe 20. The officer imagined the toy gun in Tamir's hand as real and a threat, at least in part because he presumed the boy to be a man with violent intent, rather than a child deeply engaged in make-believe play. Similarly, neighborhood watchman George Zimmerman could not imagine Trayvon Martin as a boy who might reasonably be sauntering home, who might reasonably be frightened at being pursued by an adult. Instead, Zimmerman's defense for killing Trayvon and the public discourse surrounding the incident centered on constructing the 17-year-old as an adult man with suspect movement, threatening physicality, and malevolent intentions. We argue here that Black boyhood itself has been rendered both unimagined and unimaginable. For us, Black boyhood is the material and discursive social phenomenon of childhood for Black boys. Rather than a developmental phase on the way to Black manhood, Black boyhood is the social experience in the now, not merely for some future existence or accomplishment in which Black boys possess their own agental subjectivity and impact the world even as they remain vulnerable to the material effects of racism, the narrow constructions of masculinity, and the hegemonic notion that their lives as children only matters because who others want them to be or fear they may become in adulthood. Thus, to assert that Black boyhood is unimagined and unimaginable is to lament that we've created a world in which Black boys cannot be. And there's one final excerpt here, and it begins with a question. So what becomes possible if we begin to see Black boys anew, as children, with all of the agency and freedom envisioned in critical notions of childhood, and without the anxiety and sense of limitation brought to bear on Black boys in educational research and everyday discourse on Black males? We suggest that a reimagining of Black boyhood challenges us to think creatively about how to create and nurture spaces for Black boys so that they can self-determine and shape their own worldviews. Such spaces are equally important for adolescent Black males. Indeed, a commitment to protecting young Black boys makes it that much easier to understand all Black youth, including Black girls and Black trans youth, as still vulnerable to the adult repression and still worthy of spaces to just be and be in their now. and prioritizing the social, emotional, and educational needs and interests of Black boys over and above the dismal social and educational statistics about Black males actually shifts our attention to considering how schools can be sites of discovery and joy for Black boys. And then lastly, when we acknowledge that Black boys have legitimate fears and frustrations and sadness about their lived experiences in school, we might actually challenge ourselves to think about our roles in protecting Black boys and defending them from a host of assaults on their bodies and spirits. And then thus schools and community centers, neighborhoods, and families must become places that are less concerned with, again, for instance, the discipline and control of Black male bodies, and more concerned with being places where Black boys can giggle, play, crowd, and be just as silly and frivolous as other children without these activities being perceived as an impediment to their educational attainment or a threat to the well-being of others. So I just wanted to share those excerpts from the Reimagining Black Boyhood essay itself as a way to legitimize the need in popular and scholarly discourse around this reimagining, and kind of using these two high-profile deaths by police officers in the US as a way to kind of illustrate its profound legitimacy. Now I want to step back a bit. And sometimes it's difficult for us in our everyday lives to see the ways in which American culture with respect to boyhood and Black masculinity actually gets in our way of seeing the real humanity of Black boys. And so just naming it and being explicit about what we mean when we're talking about culturally with boyhood and Black masculinity, broadly within the US, when we're talking about boyhood, there are specific tropes or qualities that are associated with it. So you see them listed there: physical toughness, emotional stoicism, and independence and autonomy as these qualities that we often associate with a prevailing boy code. But then when this boy code gets overlaid with racism and poverty within the US context, these norms and qualities and expectations take on a hyper form. So hyperaggression, anti-intellectualism, and hypersexuality become these very specific norms that we associate with Black masculinity. And just to expand a little bit more in terms of what is meant by anti-intellectualism, it wasn't necessarily a lack of an astute kind of cultural critique or being socially conscious or critically conscious of their everyday lives in terms of the neighborhoods and communities and contexts they navigate, but it was more of a resistance to formal academic learning and not seeing its everyday applicability to their lives. And so there was a critical consciousness of their social environment that they were actually quite astute with, but then at the same time seeing formal academics as not having a direct impact on their everyday lives. And then I also want to situate the kind of reimagining of Black boyhood within a larger public discourse that often gets referred as the Black male crisis. So in 2016 in the New York Times, there was a piece that published that stated there's something very different happening with young Black men, and it's something we can no longer ignore. And this crisis is often characterized by a set of social and academic outcomes. So outside of schools, we see Black boys and men leading the US in rates of homicide, suicide, and incarceration. But then within the context of schools, we see them overrepresented in suspension and expulsion rates and underrepresented in advanced placement and honors courses. And then there's a greater likelihood of them being designated as students who have special needs and then ultimately drop out of high school. So again, these are the various social and academic outcomes that make up this crisis that often frames our view of Black boys and men and gets in the way of even our ability to actually see young Black boys as boys in and of themselves. And then in thinking about how do we bring intentionality to relationship building within the schools and classrooms for Black boys in relationship with their teachers, there was another question that came up for me, which is how do teachers actually facilitate or best facilitate these positive learning relationships with Black boys during these two particular stages of their development, during childhood and during early adolescence. So I often argue that most of my other researchers, scholars, activists in boys' education who focus on Black boys particularly tend to zoom in on later stages of their development. So mid to late adolescence up through young adulthood tends to be the focus in the scholarship. But I often argue that a lot of these social and academic outcomes actually have their origin during early and middle childhood, up through early adolescence. And that there's more that we need to learn about their experiences during earlier stages of development so that we can intervene at earlier stages to actually set them up to be able to thrive in a world that oftentimes marginalizes them. Or what are ways in which we can build more robust supports and interventions in earlier stages of their development that actually support their success. So moving into presenting the kind of relational teaching framework itself, it opens with a framing around, as we all know, and is familiar, I imagine, to many of you, that relationships matter for Black boys, and that positive teacher-student relationships are critical for boys of color and across various kinds of learning contexts. So as I'll speak to in a moment, this particular framework came out of a study of Black boys that were in a single-sex middle school for boys of color. But these strategies that represent a way to kind of teach more relationally actually have applicability across a various range of school types. And I think it's important to note that we have to underscore the importance of relationship building within schools, oftentimes because, as many of you know, I imagine, that schools tend to be these highly routinized, structured spaces where there's high stakes around testing and performance and academic achievement, that in an environment of that type, relationships are deemed frivolous, are seen as not valuable, or not seen as an important investment, but as in a stance or an argument of this framework that relationships are actually the very medium through which actually learning happens, and particularly the case for historically marginalized students within schools and classrooms. But our current interventions that are rooted in testing and performance actually get in the way of the very thing that students and children need to be successful, is those positive teacher-student relationships. So you see also here is that it's these deficit-oriented perceptions around Black boys, particularly with boyhood and Black masculinity, that oftentimes Black boys get viewed as arelational, as not wanting or desiring a close relationship with their teacher. They want to do it on their own. They want to stand on their own 2 feet. But at the same time, they too expressed a genuine desire for those close relationships with their teachers. And other factors that contribute to relationships being perceived as not mattering as much is that there's the public discourse again around Black boys being either dangerous or at risk and need to be saved. And then ultimately, it's these narrow conceptions that tend to be destructive. They tend to operate unconsciously, and then often skew teachers' perceptions of who their boys actually are, and then which actually gets in their way of actually meeting their distinct learning needs. So it's these core stances that make up relationships mattering for Black boys and an intentionality needing to be brought to them in the practice of educators. And then to just underscore that this framework came out of 2 larger studies around relationships with Black boys within schools and within single-sex schools for boys of color in particular. You see these 2 texts here. The first one to the left, Schooling for Resilience, Improving the Life Trajectories of Black and Latino Boys. This was a study that was a part of my doctoral studies and training, where there were 7 single-sex middle and high schools for boys of color in New York City, Chicago, Houston, and Atlanta. And it was a 3-year study where the primary goal was to describe what's happening within this distinct kind of learning environment. So around 2003, there were foundations and large urban school districts throughout the country that positioned single-sex schools for boys of color as a response or an intervention to the Black male crisis. But the argument of this particular study was that these schools were opening up at questionable speeds without really an empirical basis, without research that informs the effectiveness of this serving as an intervention. But they became highly popular and schools began to open all over the country with this model in mind, but again, with no kind of research to support their efficacy. So the task was to be essentially descriptive, to actually hold a mirror up to what's actually happening within these contexts and how boys were experiencing them. And what we learned, fundamentally is that first and foremost, you need a good school. And many of them struggled in that regard. And actually to this date, maybe 3 of the schools are actually still open. The other 4 have closed. But we did learn that some of the things that actually these schools did very well is around parent and community engagement, around supporting boys' positive identity development, the development of mentorship program with community-based individuals. So there's these other dimensions of school life that these schools actually served as a great model that could be shared with other schools around how to support boys of color and their success. And then the other study in the book, I Can Learn From You, Boys as Relational Learners. This was a study that I was a research assistant for as well during my doctoral studies, where we asked about 3,000 boys and about 1,500 of their teachers in 6 different countries to describe for us a relationship with a boy that was successful, and then also describe a relationship with a boy that was challenging for them. And we asked the same question of boys themselves. So tell us about a relationship that you had with a teacher that was successful, and then tell us about a relationship with a teacher that you struggled. And it was our analysis across these 2 sets of narratives that allowed us to develop this larger relational teaching framework. So in this text, I Can Learn From You, Boys as Relational Learners, there's about 12 to 15 relational teaching strategies that are described based on the narratives that were shared with us. And so this relational teaching with Black boys framework that I'm presenting actually is an analysis from a subset of boys who attended a single-sex middle school for boys of color in New York City. And the task was to determine which of these strategies were particularly salient for Black boys in light of their race and gender and class background. So of a list of essentially 12 relational teaching strategies within a larger framework, there were 4 that were found to be particularly salient for Black boys. And I'll share those with you in a moment. So just to frame the relational teaching framework itself, there are some stances that are associated with it that I think are important to earmark, where boys' relationships with their teachers are very much perceived and conceived as a working alliance, a partnership, a collaboration. But it definitely puts the role of the teacher, or definitely puts the teacher in the role of the relationship manager. And that needs to oftentimes be clearly stated, because in our conversations with teachers, what we often heard from them was that he must meet me halfway. My door is always open. I've done all that I can to support this boy's success. And so, in essence, what they were arguing for, or what they were expecting of the boys that they taught, to be ones to come to them to initiate a conversation about how they could repair the relationship, or even forge the relationship oftentimes. So our stance with this framework is that early to late adolescence as a developmental period for Black boys is all consuming in and of itself, particularly as they're navigating a deeper focus on their own identities with respect to race and gender. They're the influence of their peers and navigating their learning context, and then also navigating their neighborhoods and communities, their kind of resistance or pulling away from family. All of those developmental factors serve as a preoccupation for them. That it serves us as educators well to acknowledge where they are developmentally and think of ourselves in this role as the relationship manager as a result. And it means then that the extension of relational gestures actually will allow teachers to cultivate a positive learning relationships with their boys. And again, it's particularly at these forging stages or in the beginning of the relationship and when there's conflicts that emerges. And it also has the stance too that oftentimes we hear among teachers or even school leaders in their support and development of teachers is that some teachers are relational and then some teachers are not. Some teachers are born with it or have this innate ability to be relational with students, and then other teachers struggle and just are not relational. And it's a stance of this framework that actually all teachers have the capacity and the ability to develop and acquire relational skills or become more skilled at being more relational in their practice, when provided with coaching and support and development around building those relationships. You know, it's also kind of rooted in our fundamental nature as human beings to be social beings that then desire and long for connection and intimacy in our relationships and closeness in our relationships. And we have the ability to establish those. We all do, in terms of thinking about human development. And this is not to say that relationship struggles didn't present themselves. And actually they were quite commonplace. So then the goal becomes, again, a stance of all teachers have the capacity to acquire and refine their relational skills, but still these relational struggles will emerge. But over time, you still will see growth and improvement in that relationship. Now, the final point there is that actually the starting point of these relationships, as we heard from the boys and also from the teachers themselves, is that boys wanted a sense from their teachers that they were conveying a sense of mastery of their subject or mastery of their content. And sometimes it wasn't as formal as mastery, as much as it was a passion about the knowledge base or about the subject matter that they were hoping to convey to their students. And then also they wanted a sense of a kind of a clear set of humane behavioral expectations. So for example, as a classroom teacher myself, there was always this expectation that boys walked down the hall in a straight line, that there was a square outside of my classroom door that each boy was to stand in when we were preparing to walk down the hall, or that we would have silent lunches. So that, or that most of how we spent our class time was seated in desks and in rows. So boys often perceive those practices as inhumane and not responsive in any way to their development. And so to begin the trust or establish the trust that is the critical starting point for the development of a positive teacher-student relationship is conveying to boys a mastery of their subject, as well as conveying that they are attempting to implement in their classroom a more humane behavioral set of expectations. Now, here are the 4 strategies themselves that emerged, again, as more salient for Black boys. And beginning with reaching out, going beyond, this was a strategy that communicated to boys that teachers perceived their learning need or social emotional need as more important than a school policy or procedure, or a boy's personhood was more important to a teacher than a school policy or practice. And so the backdrop to that is oftentimes teachers are seen as the arbiters of policy. They must ensure that all policy is administered in equitable ways. They have to ensure that all procedures are followed consistently. But boys noticed that when their teachers reached out and went beyond those school procedures to meet a very distinct learning need for them, that they appreciated that and that supported their relationship. And these are simple gestures as driving a boy to the bus stop if he stayed after school late to get help with homework. Or if you know that there's a food insecurity issue at home, making sure that you have extra snacks in your classroom. So these simple practices that when you open up the teacher handbook or district handbook around appropriate and inappropriate behaviors of teachers or boundaries among teachers and students, those actions would fall into the inappropriate category. But if boys saw teachers extending these gestures in a moment that's meant to serve their learning and their development, they were appreciative of that, and it fostered their relationship. With personal advocacy, this was in relation to boys that were arguably struggling more academically, and then often tended to be boys that were more resistant in their demeanor, meaning more aligned with traditional norms of boyhood and Black masculinity. And the gesture here requires teachers to seek out what are boys' individual interests and talents. And they may be a student in your math class struggling in terms of their performance academically, but boys reported and teachers reported that when they made an effort to see the boy demonstrating an interest or a talent outside of their class, that helped their relationship. So if they were in a play that was being conducted at school, or if they were an athlete, or if they were a musician, going to see them perform at church on Sunday in the choir as the drummer of the choir, these interests and talents that boys possessed outside of their classroom, teachers and boys themselves saw as important. Now, I think an important distinction is that seeing these boys exercise these interests and talents outside of your classroom becomes important for re-engaging them in the learning in your own classroom. So as well as they may be struggling in math, your efforts to see their other interests and talents is in the service of getting to know them as boys in the world, but also that you can use this newfound knowledge about them to re-engage them in the learning in your own individual classroom, which is key because it's a positive learning relationship, a relationship that facilitates their growth academically, in addition to their growth in terms of their identity. With establishing common ground, this is where teachers make an effort to see the ways in which they're similar to the boys that they teach. And again, simple gestures as recognizing that you guys have on the same Timberland boots, or that you have the same iPhone, or you watch the same television show. That these simple gestures allowed, in many ways, the boys to see themselves in their teachers, and the teachers to also see themselves in the boys. So it becomes a window into seeing each other and the common ground that exists in your lives that actually facilitates a connection or a sense of feeling seen by a teacher that then opens them up to learning more from that teacher. And then the last strategy here is around accommodating opposition. So this one for me is typically the more difficult to describe. And the example that I share here is, imagine you have a student in marking period 1 who is exhibiting difficulty with handing in their homework consistently. And you recognize it as an issue. You maybe reach out to colleagues to think through an intervention or a support to provide in order for them to increase their homework completion. Marking period 2 comes along and you implement this intervention. And you start to see significant growth in their homework completion in a more timely manner. But then marking period 3 comes along, and early in that marking period, you start to see them reverting back to an old pattern of not handing in their homework consistently. And usually coming from a place of urgency and care and regard for that particular boy and wanting to continue to support their success, what tends to happen in those moments is that there's usually a stiff consequence that's implemented by teachers in order to ensure that they stay on the right path. And where accommodating opposition comes in is, instead of initiating, again, that stiff consequence that comes from a place of wanting to support their success and ensure that they don't revert back to an old pattern, doesn't become something that actually begins to serve as a rupture in that relationship. So oftentimes the stiff consequence gets perceived by the boy as unfair and inhumane, that then causes a rupture in the relationship or a conflict in the relationship. And then what we've heard from teachers and boys about what tends to happen is that during marking period 4, marking period 5, and marking period 6, they're not handing in their homework, which is having clear ramifications for their performance in your class. So with accommodating opposition, what we're asking for there is in taking an initial step to be curious about the behaviors that are reverting back to an old pattern. Ask questions that help you better understand what experiences or things that may be happening in his life that allows you to have an understanding to decide how to more productively respond and repair the relationship or maintain the relationship or keep the relationship intact, so that whatever adjustments you need to make to the intervention that's supporting his success with homework completion can still be leveraged, can still be successful. But if we see his reverting back to an old pattern as an affront or disrespectful to you as a classroom teacher, or as a challenge, or as him being resistant, we miss the opportunity to use that relationship as a window to better understanding his experience so that we can more productively respond and not cause a rupture that then has clear ramifications for his success in your classroom, which you don't want as their teacher, and which they don't want either as a student who has a genuine desire oftentimes to be a good student and do well in school. So these are the 4 strategies that were found to be particularly salient for Black boys in light of their race and gender and class background. And so what I would typically do in this next segment is give you all the opportunity to take a moment to reflect on the relationships in your own schools and classrooms with Black boys themselves. So I ask you to think about what are the relationships that you have with Black boys in your schools and classrooms that you would characterize as strong, or that you would characterize as positive, and actually naming that boy and actually describing a typical interaction with that boy that you feel characterizes this relationship as positive or successful. And then also thinking about the relationships with Black boys that are in need of growth, or where you've had struggles, or where you've encountered challenges. Again, what's that boy's actual name? Or what are these boys' names? And what are some experiences that you've had with them that you can narrate? And as you think about these challenging as well as successful relationships, where do you see these relational teaching practices potentially being helpful in facilitating that positive relationship, or actually ones that you see maybe in the future with relationships with boys where you're struggling that could potentially be more helpful? And what I'll also say about these strategies is that they present themselves, I imagine, as commonsensical, as absolutely what one as a teacher or educator should do to foster positive relationships with Black boys in their classrooms. But sometimes, again, when you're in a school context that is high speed, or like in many ways a high speed train that is kind of doubling down on accountability and test prep and have rigid policies and practices to support those very discrete outcomes, relationships get pushed out of the way. And so this can very well be a reflective exercise around taking a step back, reflecting on your relationships, and seeing the very human ways that you're actually exercising a lot of these strategies, so that you feel more confident and more sure-footed in extending these strategies, that you have a sense over time there's a likelihood that they will actually improve that relationship. It gives you kind of a clear-headedness, again, a sure-footedness, that as you extend these gestures and specific learning-based moments to support their success, that you will begin to see over time their growth. So let that be known in the sense that they're a guide, a reference point that represent oftentimes too the very emotionally charged nature of relationships. So sometimes in the moment, an exchange takes place, something gets said, something gets done that triggers a strong emotional reaction that then you're trying to figure out in that split second moment, how do I respond? That it's clarity around these gestures that allows you to kind of think more quickly in the moment about what relational gesture could I extend in this moment that will produce the most positive outcome. An outcome that is both supportive to you and your role as the classroom teacher, and also supportive to the role of the student as the boy in your classroom. So I think too, that's an important kind of note, that the emotionally charged nature of oftentimes these exchanges between teachers and students really necessitate us having some clarity around what are some gestures or steps we can take to address these moments that we often have with the students that we teach. And oftentimes those emotional reactions are because we care and we want to be successful and we want to ensure a positive outcome from this exchange. So I'll conclude with this final slide here, which are just some takeaways for all of you, where from the outset, I don't want to clearly overstate or imply in any way that you'll have overwhelmingly positive relationships with all of the boys in all of your classrooms. I think the task or the goal is to develop more of a relational antenna, where in your classrooms with your Black boys in those classrooms or in those school communities, that your antenna is up relationally to ensure that there's at least one adult in that school building that that boy has a particularly strong relationship with. And positive relationships mean not necessarily that there's always going to be the highest level of closeness between you and that student. That there's a range of positive relationships, and some relationships may be closer or more connected than others, but generally there's a positive relationship there that is supporting their learning. But if you do notice that a boy appears to not have at least one school adult that they have a close relationship with, that you as a teacher are looking through ways to support that boy in establishing that kind of relationship with at least one adult in the school building or more, and using potentially some of these gestures as a way to facilitate that. And there are times where life circumstances outside of school may very well pose insurmountable challenges to even the most relationally skilled teachers in the development of those relationships. And that's still not to say, however, even those life circumstances and challenges present themselves, that there is, with time, growth in that relationship that can be achieved with the consistent, purposeful extension of these gestures. And I think it's important to acknowledge as well that all relationships go through stages of connection, disconnection, and reconnection. That just acknowledging that those dimensions that are part of our relational lives in schools and classrooms with our students is important to recognize, so that then you don't have a false sense that every single interaction with the students that you teach is going to be relationally positive. That they will all cycle through these phases of connection, disconnection, and reconnection. And it's these gestures that still allow for that connection that's needed to support their learning to still exist. And there needs to be a commitment on the part of the teacher to always be reflective or reevaluate the extension of their gestures. So potentially having a critical friend or colleague that you can reach out to reflect on these relationships. So I had this interaction with this student. This is what took place. This is how I responded. This is how he responded. Here's the outcome. You know, what parts of this do you think work well? What parts of it do you think going forward I can improve upon? But that the way you get better as a relational teacher is allowing yourself to be in a community with others who are supporting each other in these relational teaching ways. And then lastly, it's it's arguably insufficient for you to just be a relational teacher within your own individual classroom. So these relational teaching gestures with Black boys are only best utilized or best leveraged when they're in a school context that actually is prioritizing relationship building or has a relational school culture. And what I mean by that, you can actually point to different policies or practices or traditions within those schools where you see relationships being prioritized. You see them being valued. You see them being actually given time in the school day to be fostered and cultivated and developed. So relational teaching strategies can exist in an individual classroom without their full ability to support boys' learning and success needs to be within a context where school leaders see relationships as important and can point to various aspects of school life where relationship building is the fundamental goal of the school. So essentially, that's what I wanted to share with you all today. And I guess at this moment, I'm happy to open it up to questions, comments, thoughts, or reactions from all of you. So thank you very much.
So this